Good evening and welcome. This is the People's Platform. Our topic of discussion tonight is Sri Lanka after the aragalaya. What has changed, and has the political class actually started listening to the people of Sri Lanka? The aragalaya, or the people's struggle, could be loosely defined as a collective embodiment and display of societal frustration and angst owing to monumental political mismanagement, fiscal mismanagement and corruption. We saw this convergence and outpouring of dissatisfaction with the political class at the Colombo Golf Face, the heart of Colombo's political, economic and cultural power. But after the aragalaya, has the political class actually expressed willingness to sit and listen to the grievances of the people? Equally also, has the aragalaya been a symbol of the people's willingness to listen to the views from the periphery, beyond the majoritarian narratives that have dominated the discourse over the years? To reflect on the complexities and nuances, we've invited to our studio political scientist Professor Jayadeva Uyangoda. Good evening and welcome, Professor.
Good evening, Sonali.
Wonderful to have you here with us today. My first question to you, the aragalaya was a unique and unprecedented development in Sri Lankan politics, where the citizens decided to take politics into their own hands instead of waiting to be constantly misled by their elected representatives. It also embodied the aspirations of Sri Lankans, which went beyond ethnicity, class, sexual orientation and gender, where people actually dared to challenge the status quo and hold to account politicians. What are your reflections on the aragalaya and its aftermath?
Well, Sonali, what you described in your question are some of the specific and unique features of the aragalaya. Actually, it represented and marked a democratic moment in Sri Lanka. It's one of the rare moments in which people, the citizens, have decided to take the political process into their own hands as well. You see, the political class has been actually dominating the political process for the past several decades, even under democracy. Democracy is supposed to be the rule of the people, but in practice what has happened is the democracy is the rule of the political class, and Sri Lankan people, have at last decided that they should no longer be voters alone. They are citizens, active citizens, citizens who have been watching very carefully and critically the performance of the political class, and they are utterly dissatisfied with the performance for the past several decades. That's why there was this slogan for a system change, and they also wanted political class to listen to them. And they were proposing some systematic changes and transformation in order for Sri Lanka democracy to be strengthened, to be revived, to be deepened. But sadly and unfortunately, major sections of the political class, what you call the ruling class, or those who, the ruling sections of the political class don't seem to have understood this message peacefully and democratically delivered to them by the citizens. They have, to make it worse, even misunderstood it. That's why you could see that, instead of listening to the citizens' demand for a change in favor of democratization of society, politics, state-society relations, they are now, trying to ignore those demands. So that is unfortunately the tragedy of Sri Lankan politics at the moment. When citizens say something on their own, we have a political class that does not want to listen to those, the appeals of the people. Actually, it's more than an appeal. It's a demand that came from the people.
There's also a widening gap between the socio-political and economic reality and the way in which the political class understands or fails to understand, and the way they react to it. So it sometimes defies logic, the extent to which the political class is so clueless as to the grievances of the people, the public, the citizenry that they are bound to serve. How do you view this absolute disconnect between the people's grievances and the elected officials?
Actually, what you just described, tells us that there is a very serious condition of alienation on the part of the political class from the people, from ordinary people, from the citizens who actually voted them into power. So the political class listens to certain other constituencies. The people who finance political parties, or the business class, or the class of entrepreneurs, investors. Actually, there are certain communities who the political class will very loyally listen to, but not to the people who vote them into power, who also authorize them to rule. So that is why this, the gap between the political class and the citizens, that's also what the aragalaya in a way symbolizes. The people are no longer willing to accept this treatment by the political class, this kind of neglect as you were explaining. So it's very important that for us to recognize there is a new polarization in Sri Lankan society in political terms. Polarization, that polarization represents two extremes. One is the people, the citizens who are politically awakened, right? And also this politically insensitive political class. That polarization is one of the fundamental defining factors of Sri Lankan politics today and in the period ahead.
On this topic of active citizen engagement in governance, we've found that up to now, there's been certain political indifference among citizens, electoral absenteeism, this culture of individualism. So if a corrupt politician is elected into office, that is not my problem because I am employed, I don't belong to the impoverished class, so therefore it's not going to affect my life. That kind of individualistic mentality,
yes.
And that is widespread.
Yeah, I think that has been widespread, but I think it has changed. That aragalaya, to me, represents a paradigmatic change in the way the Sri Lankan citizens look at the world, look at politics, and look at themselves as well as citizens. You see, now the citizens' indifference to politics is also part of the legacy of liberal parliamentary democracy. You see, mostly the people's political role has been traditionally limited to voting. Right? Even they are no longer active members of political parties. They become active in their political parties only during election times. So Sri Lankan people have for decades been functioning in political terms primarily as voters. Now what the recent changes in Sri Lankan politics indicate is that the people in this country have decided to become active citizens.
Right.
Active in the sense that they would vote at elections, but they would also want to see how the political system works, how the politicians, the political class perform, how the governments, any government would, implement the promises to the voters. And also to what extent these representatives are actually representing the interests of the voters, the electors. So that's one of the questions that, during the aragalaya, it came up very sharply because people think that the representatives they elect actually do not represent them at all.
Yeah.
Not the people's interest, the interest of some other people who may have, financed them, who may have been, providing them other kinds of support. So, the active citizenry is one of the most important things that we can notice in Sri Lanka today. But that's also one reason why the political class, some sections of the political class seems to have been a little, let me describe it as, they are worried about it. Because you have active citizens, not politically sleeping citizens.
Yeah.
They want citizens to be very passive politically. When citizens are active, it's a totally different, political game. So then they demand changes, they demand accountability, they demand transparency, they demand explanations from political class, politicians, and even officials in power. So usually the ruling classes don't like in citizens to be active at that level. So that's why, when I use the word, the aragalaya represented a kind of a paradigm change in Sri Lankan politics. It's very difficult to ignore that, although some, leading members of the political class want to ignore that. It's very difficult because it's, it marks a kind of turning point in Sri Lanka's democratic politics. You see, Sri Lankan people as citizens want more democracy. You see, when you look at Sri Lanka's population today from the point of view of democracy, right, you can see that there are three classes of people. There's a very small, tiny class of people who do not want democracy.
Wow.
Right? There is a slightly bigger class of people who do not want much democracy. They are happy with a little democracy. And there is a vast majority of people who want more democracy, Sri Lanka. I think the contradiction today, one of the primary contradictions in Sri Lankan society and politics today is that, gap between, or this, incompatibility between the two classes of people, the majority who want more democracy and a tiny little coalition of two minorities. One group does not want democracy, the other group wants a little democracy.
Right.
So I think Sri Lankan politics to a large extent will be decided by the way in which this contradiction is going to play it out in the coming period.
Okay. To quote Dr. Pakiasoti Saravanamuttu at a recent event, he said that there is a crisis in governance, and he said that we need to redesign the social contract formula. How do you view this, given that as citizens we have a legitimate expectation that our best interests will be upheld and protected, and we need that reassurance from those we elect into office? When there is this trust deficit, and that is clear to see, how do we fix it within a democratic framework?
Yeah, the concept of a social contract is actually a metaphor to describe the relationship between the rulers and the ruled, voters and the voted, or rather voters and the representatives. And that relationship is based on, as you said, trust. And also that that's a contractual relationship, in this metaphorical, description. There are certain terms and conditions. So people give power to politicians at two levels at an election. They elect the representatives and also they authorize them to rule, right? On certain conditions, on certain terms. But, when the rulers violate the terms and conditions of that contract, a democratic theory says that people have a right to recall them. We have to ask them. That's why every election is a moment for citizens as voters to renew their social contract with the political class. So what has been happening is that Sri Lankan citizens have realized that, there's a, continuous violations of the terms of that social contract between citizens and the rulers. So they don't want to tolerate it any longer, saying that either we recall you, oh, let's have a new social contract. That means new set of terms that bind the relationship between citizens and the rulers. So, in a way, say we are now talking about a new constitution. Sometimes you can also describe the constitution of a country is a fundamental framework of a social contract between citizens and the rulers. But we are now talking about a constitution. There was a constitutional amendment recently also. But no one talks about this, specific dimension of a constitution of a country as a basic, document pertaining to the social contract. Right? So we have to look at it that way as well. That's why people should be active, should be an active constituency in drafting a constitution, in preparing a constitution. People, views should be consulted. There should be a process in which people are actively participating in the constitutional, making process. So we have constitutional amendments. People are just outsiders. People are not even observers. People are told that you accept what we decide for you. That's the message by the political class to the people. So Dr. Saranamuthu's this metaphor, social contract, is very important. Actually, once again, to go back to our key word in our theme today, the aragalaya is a moment in which Sri Lankan citizens began to question the way in which the political class has been treating the social contract. They are saying that political class has been actually violating the social contract. We have to change the whole, the relationship between us and the political class, either through a new social contract or making the political class, answerable, accountable, and bound by the terms of the social contract.
One key aspiration of the aragalaya, the people's struggle, was to tackle economic accountability or corruption, large-scale corruption happening at the highest echelons of power. In addressing corruption, let's talk about the role of money in politics. Currently in Sri Lanka, there are no campaign finance laws. There is no mandatory provision to enable disclosure of assets. How must we change the laws in order to enable and ensure that politicians are truly held to account in terms of making mandatory disclosures, ensuring campaign finance is documented?
Actually, what you just described represents one of the key dimensions of the crisis of representational democracy in Sri Lanka, because the electoral process has been subjected to the influence by those who have wealth, who have money, and who finance individual candidates as well as political parties. So political corruption has become actually a normal dimension of Sri Lankan politics, and it has happened in many other countries as well. So the normalization of political corruption is one of the key reasons for the decay of democracy in Sri Lanka. That is why, that's also this issue has been highlighted during the aragalaya as well. That's why people are saying that we need a new political culture.
Right.
We need our representatives to be accountable. The accountable governance means, particularly, in terms of, say, the political parties also. Political parties theoretically are considered as the main link between citizens and the state. They are the link in a democracy. But political parties are not democratic in Sri Lanka in that sense of the term, because there's a question of party democracy. There is also non-disclosure of funding. There are a lot of issues involved. How political parties are being funded. So that openness and transparency is one of the questions about relationship between political parties and democracy. But on the other hand, there are some other issues about this. The question of corruption has become so integrated into the political process that is also very difficult to tackle, because no amount of laws can control corruption,
right.
because it has become a kind of a canker in body politic, right? Corruption and political corruption. So that is why I think there is a huge crisis of legitimacy between in relation to representation, political parties and ruling parties, and governance. And the crisis of governance is also partly a crisis of legitimacy of the political parties and the governments.
Professor, do you think that the prevailing system of justice actually act as a deterrent when it comes to those with political prowess and patronage? If I am a politician and I want to get into criminality, would I think, if I do this, I will have to bear the brunt of the law, therefore I must not do it? That kind of deterrent attitude, is the current justice system successful at doing that, or where is the gap?
So there is also a deep crisis in the justice system in Sri Lanka. Actually, law enforcement process is subject to a lot of political influence, and there's a great deal of politicization. In fact, during the aragalaya period, the Inspector General of Police himself, made a very interesting comment about it. Said most of the police OICs have been politically appointed by, the recommendation of local, political bosses. So there's a politicization of the police services also. He said politicization of the the police force has become such a big problem. Is that even the IGP cannot control this, his own police service. So he was making that comment only a few months ago. But unfortunately, law enforcement process has always been subjected to this kind of political interference and political influence. So how can we expect justice in a society where there's no independent, autonomous, accountable law enforcement process? And that has a direct implication for the justice system as well. So that shows the institutional decay in Sri Lanka's system of governance, because citizens don't have a protection if the law enforcement process is so politicized.
Is there a strong enough multifaceted front to take on these bad guys?
Well, unfortunately, no. The Sri Lankan citizens are quite aware of these things. The media reports, there's a lot of media reporting on these things, of late, particularly after the advent of the social media. But the thing is that, so the police commission was appointed, under either the 17th Amendment, under independent commissions, but it's not effective. And so that is, I think, one of the key areas in any program for democratic reforms, right? And Sri Lanka doesn't have even civil society, pressure in order to, at least to tell the government that, reforms in the police service is very urgent. the police commissions, I think one of the jobs would be to propose those institutional reforms for the police service. I don't think that has been happening. So in any democratization agenda in Sri Lanka, I think it's very, very important to think about reforms in the police service and reforms in the criminal justice process and reforms in the judicial accountability as well.
Right. Okay. Fantastic. We're going for a short commercial break. We'll be right back.
ගමට සතුට ගෙන එන ගම්මැද්ද රට නගන ජනපෞර
ජාත්‍යන්තර සහයෝගය ගෝලීය අභියෝග මූල්‍ය අර්බුදය ලෝකයේ සමග ශ්‍රී ලංකාව යා කරන හරවත් මිනිත්තු 30ක් මිලින්ද සමග නියමාර්ථය.
Welcome back. We are in conversation with Professor Jayadeva Uyangoda, political scientist. We're discussing Sri Lanka after the aragalaya. Professor, when I was having a conversation with you before the show on what we should talk about, I said let's try to make the conversation aspirational and hopeful. On the topic of the aragalaya, something that we also need to focus on is, I think we need to look beyond the city centers, the majoritarian rhetoric that has been dominating the conversations over the past decades. When we talk about the views from the peripheries in order to enable broader social transformation, the mothers of the disappeared, for example, from the north, have been protesting every day for the past 2,000 days and continuing. These are grievances that don't really get reported in mainstream media, in Sinhala media, in English media. So this contradiction between these dominant narratives juxtaposed with the voices of the mothers of the disappeared, whose voices, whose grievances, whose tears just don't make it to the television screens, to policymakers' briefs. How must we be better?
You see that question about very serious human rights violations, disappearances. This was a part of the political conversation among politicians as well some time ago. That's also part of this whole controversy about the UNHRC resolutions, what the UNHRC was going to do with regard to these complaints. But it has been unfortunately politicized in Sri Lanka, either by those regimes that were in power, or by ethno-nationalist forces. But that issue continues because the mothers and the family members of those disappeared during the Northeast War continue to push for justice. That's why this, the question of transitional justice has been one of the key themes in the conversation in peace building in Sri Lanka, to create a genuinely post-conflict, post-war situation, post-war condition for Sri Lanka. It's important to address the questions of justice actually. But no government has taken these issues seriously. Even the present government doesn't seem to be taking it seriously, because when the issue was raised DRC, it always, portrayed as something against Sri Lanka. But no, Sri Lanka's future depends a lot on the way in which the issues relating to what happened during the war are settled and addressed, because justice is very important for the victims of the war. Many of these families are direct victims of the Northeast War. So they need justice. That's why they have been fighting for justice for many, many years. So that requires actually, ensuring justice to those who have been victims of war, violence, victims from all sides actually. That's one of the most, unfulfilled, promises of, politicians who have been in power for the past several years. And that's why it has been internationalized as well, because there's no, justice, no redress appearing to come from within the country. Yeah. Then of course it becomes internationalized. But the moment it becomes internationalized, it gives an opportunity for the local, governments and politicians to repoliticize the issue.
Right.
Using the rhetoric of majoritarian patriotism. That's what happened even recently as last few weeks ago. So I think from the human rights point of view, from the democracy point of view, from the point of view of peace, reconciliation, and sustainable peace in Sri Lanka, it is very important to address these issues, in a way that interethnic peace has a chance to survive irrespective of the kind of crisis we are facing in Sri Lanka today. Now we have a very serious economic crisis at the moment. That economic crisis will exacerbate a huge social crisis. And the social crisis will lead to another phase of political crisis in Sri Lanka. So the coming few months are likely to be characterized by intensification of this triple crisis: economic crisis, social crisis, political crisis. So then there would be once again a situation where Sri Lankan politics is thrown into violence. So this has to be prevented, right? And then the political class will have to work with a little bit more political wisdom. But we don't see that level of political wisdom being displayed by the political class. So Sri Lanka, in a way, runs the risk of being thrown into another phase of internal violence. So that's the risk this country is facing once again. That's why the settling those issues, humanitarian issues, peacefully, democratically, in the name of justice is extremely important. That creates an atmosphere for the country to deal with the future threats of internal violence.
When speaking about active citizen participation in governance and this resurgence of public consciousness and being more mindful about one's own prejudices, lack of awareness about the issues of the other, one of the views from the periphery is, look, for you, protesting is just a moment or a movement. For us, protest is a way of life. How do we connect these varying narratives?
I want to return to the theme of aragalaya. Actually, aragalaya and the gold face, I saw all their narratives coming together actually.
Right.
There were citizens from the north and east who came to the gold face, and earlier there was this kind of anxiety also, this reluctance to accept that there is something important, politically important happening in the south Some people have saying that in the north. Just we already suffered this, many years ago.
Yeah.
In the south only, now you have begun to experience it. But I think that initial phase of mistrust quickly disappeared. Then everybody realized that there is a common struggle by citizens. That requires a kind of a joint coordinated attempts, in order to seek justice, in order to get justice, there has to be, countrywide, citizens movement, broad coalition, transcending ethnic barriers, transcending north-south barriers. Actually, one of the most important things I noticed during the aragalaya is that at least in the southern Sinhalese society, most of the citizens have in a way liberated themselves a kind of ideological straitjacket within which they have been imprisoned or rather kept, in a way under the ideological, influence of some sections of the majoritarian ruling class. So I think in ideological terms, you could see that the aragalaya also represented a turning point where what you described as majoritarian ethnic ideology is no longer the dominant ideological strand in the Sinhalese society. That, I think, marked a very significant shift in the politics and political consciousness of the citizens in the southern part of Sri Lanka. So that, I think, is a very important development in the politics among the people in Sri Lanka. My worry is that, there are some sections of the Sinhalese political class who would nevertheless want to take the majority of the Sinhalese people back to that majoritarian ideology. And that needs to be, combated, that needs to be defeated. But that requires a kind of, new, broad, democratic, multi-ethnic, coalition of citizens as well as political organizations, political parties as well as civil society. We have to build a broad democratic coalition in Sri Lanka. Everybody is included in that, an inclusive democratic, broad democratic coalition. So even, to, get justice for the minorities, particularly Tamil people in the north, I think their struggle needs to be actively backed by a citizens' movement in the south, right? And aragalaya had the potential to emerge as such a active citizens' movement from the south that would actually bridge the gap between, the north and the south. But that potential has not been allowed to be utilized by the citizens' movement because now citizens' movement now is under attack, right? It has been forced to take, several steps back, and it's in a way, at least in symbolic terms, in retreat. So that, I think, is a very unfortunate development. But what one can see is that once again, it's very possible that we are moving towards a phase of repoliticization of Sri Lankan citizens. In other words, the exacerbation of this economic, social and political crisis is very much a part of the political trajectory in the coming weeks and months. So we can expect a phase of repoliticization of Sri Lankan citizens once again. So how that phase will determine the relationship between the government and the citizens, that we have to wait and see. But I think the government, unfortunately, might not see it as something that they could tolerate.
Professor, my last question to you, notwithstanding the government's attempts at dissent and usage of draconian laws to quell the constitutionally enshrined right of citizens to engage in peaceful protests, how must the citizenry continue the aspirations of the aragalaya going forward?
One option the citizens have is to continue with the struggle for democracy, the struggle to defend civil and political rights, the human rights, and also learn lessons from the first stage of aragalaya. That's also very important. You see, if the aragalaya reaches the second stage, I think it has to be built on the lessons learned from the first phase of the aragalaya. So there are some very important lessons to be learned. One is that, the aragalaya need to have a broad-based support, particularly through a multi-party coalition.
Right.
You see, the aragalaya had a multi-class coalition. There was a multi-class participation in the aragalaya, but it was not cemented into a coalition.
Right.
So strong political coalition or social coalition. I think that's very, very important to deal with the government, whichever the party in power, even suppose opposition parties would be in power after an election, they would also be compelled to protect the interests of the state and interests of those who back the state, and therefore they will have to, once again resort to repressive legislation and repressive measures. So I think citizens' movement will have to think in terms of broadening the movement, in terms of its class and social composition, and also in terms of its political participation. Now, Sri Lanka's political parties in the opposition, now they are getting ready to face a possible election, parliamentary election. But working with the opposition political parties is extremely important to, convert them into, strong Democrats. Right. They are not strong Democrats because they also come from the tradition of that, parliamentary democracy, which takes citizens' participation in politics for granted. You see, in other words, Sri Lankan politics, democratic politics has to be changed in order to give a new role for the citizens also to play. But existing, liberal parliamentary system of democracy doesn't have space for that. So we have to reimagine the way, the people's participation can be assured in a new democratic order, new democratic, system of, governance. So, in other words, reinventing the democratic governance has to be part of the political imagination in the next phase of the citizen struggle. Okay. So it doesn't come from the political class or political parties.
All right. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor Jayadev Uyangoda, for joining us on this edition of the People's Platform. We'll see you again on Monday with the Sinhala version of the program. Have a safe weekend. Good night.